His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Did you know that 2026 is the semi-quincentennial of the American Revolution? We're dating that from July 4th, 1776, but today we are kicking off the year-long celebration by collaborating with our friends at LILRC, bringing you the recording of a panel discussion called Occupied Long Island Voices from the American Revolution. I want to thank LILRC for inviting me to host this panel. Thank you, Sally. And the program itself is supported by a grant from PBS WETA for library programming related to the American Revolution documentary by Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David Schmidt. This was one of only 2 grants awarded in New York State, so kudos to LILRC. And for full disclosure, I am a member of LILRC. I'm on some committees with them, and I'm working with Rob Annan on our oral history series, so happy to continue that collaboration. This is a long one, so I'm going to jump right in. I want to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to let the episode run, so there's no outro. Our outro music will be there. That's Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And we will have links in our show notes to more about our panelists and their writings. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in the order that you'll hear them, give you a little bit of their background, and they'll fill you in on where their research interests lie. So first off is Dr. Joanne Grasso, who teaches at NYIT and online for the Gilda Lehrman Institute's American History Master's Program through Gettysburg College.
I have 2 books from 2016, The American Revolution on Long Island. Then in 2018, George Washington's 1790 Grand Tour of Long Island. I am working on a 3rd one on politics in the American Revolution.
Dr. Natalie Naylor is a retired professor of history at Hofstra and the first director of their Long Island Studies Institute.
I've written many articles on Long Island history. I'm the author of Women in Long Island's Past, which has a chapter on women during the Revolution.
Claire Belageau is the president of the nonprofit organization Remember Liss, which continues her research into the life of an enslaved black woman on Long Island named Liss, whose history overlaps with many key figures of the American Revolution.
2021, I published a book for adult readers called Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution. And then I adapted it for school use, a text called Remember Liss, that's aimed at middle school and high school students.
We join our panel already in progress as we started off discussing what Long Island was like on the eve of revolution.
One of the things first when I teach or give public talks, I like to remind people of the perception that people have today of Long Island and trying to put themselves into the American Revolution at that period. You know, today we have 10 bridges, subway tunnels, 3 major airports, 2 smaller ones, yachts, everything else. It's hard for people to imagine what Long Island was like at the time. It occupied Long Island, that the only way you got off of Long Island was by boat or you swam, right? And otherwise, you either had word of mouth knowledge, the Culper Spy Ring was mentioned, or something in writing. So with Long Island occupation, which came right after, and I don't want to take everyone's time here on my panel, on our panel, they can add to this. But right after the Battle of Long Island, which was fought in Brooklyn, that battle then, by September, all of Long Island was occupied by the British and then by the Hessians as well. And because of that, there were deeply divided loyalties. Loyalists and patriots originally, before the battle, the Patriots were more in authority, more in charge of Long Island. Once that battle happened, the Loyalists came about and they started occupying different houses around. They occupied the British as well. So this was a major division going on Long Island, which also facilitated, because of it, started facilitating people going up to Connecticut.
Yeah, and so Natalie, what was Long Island in the 1775? Were they patriots? Can you say how it was leaning? So we had Brooklyn, Queens, and Suffolk, basically. How would you characterize each?
Suffolk had the most patriots, certainly, and Brooklyn, or Kings County, to be more accurate, had more loyalists. Queens was very much divided. But I'd also mention that Brooklyn was the smallest of the counties. Kings was the smallest of the counties, about 3,000 population on the eve of the war. The whole population of Long Island was about 23,000, and Suffolk was the largest. So that's the reverse of what we think of today. But it was a civil war, or would become a civil war. And even before the Battle of Long Island, North Hempstead secedes literally from the town of Hempstead. And so you have that Queens was very much divided. I have some recent statistics that for Queens in 1775, only 12% were patriots, 27% loyalists. The majority, 60%, were neutral or uncommitted. And I think those statistics are a real surprise to most people. But if I can go into the war itself, or the fighting, throughout the war, the British had martial law, but they did not maintain law and order. They confiscated goods, they stole cattle, sometimes they gave IOUs that were worthless. And with those ravages, the British lost the political war and the support of most of the residents by the end of the war.
And Claire, just to wrap up these early points, I want to ask you specifically, because this touches on, I think, Samuel Townsend. So the Patriots, they were really active, kind of stirring up the population before the Battle of Long Island. They were really articles of association, if you want to explain that. But they were really pushing or hoping that this was their moment.
Yeah, I mean, Liss was in the town of Oyster Bay, in the village of Oyster Bay, and her enslaver, Samuel Townsend, was quite a prominent politician and leader in that town. He was town clerk. But that town was so loyalist that they weren't even putting forth representatives for the New York Provincial Congress, even though Samuel knew they had to be represented in that group. And so he and his brother, Dr. James Townsend of Jericho, literally went to Flushing after Lexington and Concord had happened to a special meeting and got themselves appointed to be members of the New York Provincial Congress, even though their own villages just voted to not have anyone be part of that. And so they became part of this group. And throughout 1775, they left home. Basically, Samuel was in New York City with meetings in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan, in places like Fraunces Tavern, where they were meeting secretly and trying to figure out, what are we going to do when the British attack New York? And they were all sworn to an oath of secrecy. Now, his son became the spy, Culper Jr., but you can see that the father was already sneaking around quite a bit because they didn't want their loyalist neighbors to find out what they were discussing and what they were planning.
And so when the Empire strikes back, we're talking August 1776, and just a fun fact I discovered, the British landed Gravesend Bay, which is where they landed in the 1660s when they came to take the city from the Dutch. So the massive landing of the troops, and I think, Natalie, you say it was the largest battle of the war, would you say?
Yes, the Battle of Long Island and Brooklyn was very much thought of at the time as part of geographical Long Island, and we shouldn't forget that. It could have been the end of the war because the Patriots were very much outnumbered by the British, and if Washington had not successfully evacuated his troops, as I said, it could be the end of the war. Fighting is the most compelling part of the revolution, I guess, but the occupation was compelling also. And Long Island was occupied for longer than anywhere in the country, maybe excepting Staten Island, where they had landed first. But Staten Island's population was quite small, and Long Island's was much larger.
So what do you three see? What would you say were the steps that you see the British taking in terms of fortifications or trying to tame or manage the Long Island landscape? What would you bring up in terms of the activities the British immediately engaged in? Did they see it as, okay, now we've taken back our loyalist children here, or did they look at it, we're occupying a foreign country almost?
What I always think of is how big a regiment was. When these regiments came into Long Island towns, let's say they were going to stay over the whole winter. They were going to come in the fall, occupy the town, and leave in the spring. The Queen's Rangers was a regiment of 350 men. And think of how many houses were even in the village of Oyster Bay at that time. And so when they couldn't billet soldiers because there weren't enough houses, they took over churches and made the churches into soldiers' barracks. And so it wasn't like they were staying for the weekend. They were staying for months and using the resources of the town at will.
Because there usually wasn't fighting during the winter months. And so those were the months when the occupation had the most soldiers here.
Yeah,
and Joanne,
we still have today, which is very nice. Long Island is such a great study for any era of history. And today, as was mentioned, there were occupied houses. The British soldiers or the executive officers might stay on the, as there was with Raynham Hall, might stay on the main floor, and perhaps the family might be able to stay up on the second or third. Sagta Coast Manor down in the Bayshore area is very much like that. And there was also Rock Hall all over Long Island. And today, many of those historic sites, they still exist, which is great. You can go in and visit them and have great docent tours. Now, with that as well, the political era of that affected everything with the churches, as was mentioned. Claire mentioned that as well, that the British soldiers, and Huntington, again, is a great example of that, with the riding horses through churches that weren't affiliated with, let's say, with their own Episcopal, high or low Episcopal, any of the churches. The Quakers were able to, let's say, bypass any of that happening, although they did have their houses of worship occupied. So everything on Long Island, everything was affected by the occupation, the economics. If you look at where today, let's say where the Red Course with Eisenhower Park is, there was, the big fields over there. All the cattle were gathered over there. The British knew where things were, and they came and they took everything from Long Island, everything, facilitated things into New York City for the other soldiers there, because then after Long Island was occupied, then New York City was occupied as well. So this was really a total occupation of political, economic, and social with everyone.
And Joanne, I just want to stick on the churches for a second, because you had a story in your book about a church in Huntington and the gravestones and how the British repurposed them. Do you want to tell that?
Oh, yeah. And, this is the thing is when I have my signature on my academic sites, that American history is meant to be experienced. So I walked up there, even probably within the last 2 years. There is a cemetery up on top of what is today the Soldiers and Sailors House Monument. And there is a huge hill up there. And the British wanted that where the cemetery was, because they could, and which is what I did. I walked up there, you turn around and you can look out on the bay and see everything. So what the British soldiers did, and obviously very disrespectful, they knocked over headstones, used them to bake bread, right? Remember, it's different than today. And on the bottom of the bread would be the name of the person on the headstone. obviously with a intention to disrespect that. And there's a lot more that can be looked at in Huntington with that particular cemetery. What happened with the minister there as well, what the Huntington militia, not the Huntington militia, the British thought about with him as well.
And Claire, if you look at Raynham Hall as an example, how did that estate fare with the British coming in?
Yeah, a lot of people think about just the house that's there, but that family, the Townsend family, owned 350 acres of land as well. They owned all the land going down to Oyster Bay Harbor, and they owned the land up going out of town too, which included a large apple orchard and a high point where the British, just like in Huntington, built a fort. It wasn't built until the fall of 1778. But when they did that, they wanted to put this thing called an abatis around the fort, which was when you would take branches and surround the fort with like a whole bunch of these prickly tree branches. It was just another way to keep your enemy from getting to your fort. And the best for that was apple branches. So they cut down Samuel Townsend's vast apple orchard, which, had taken generations to become productive. And they didn't do it out of spite. They did it because that was one of the things you did when you built a fort. And when you stand up at the head of Simcoe Street, up on the height, you can see the water when the trees have lost their leaves.
And if I could mention, Joanne mentioned Rock Hall, which is in Lawrence and on the South Shore. But Rock Hall was the home of a loyalist family. So their story is quite different. And the loyalists, after all, were the law and order party, the traditional party. And they will be opening a new exhibit there later this year in their new education center.
And Natalie, I know your book focuses on a lot of women in Long Island's past. So in terms of these, incursions now, and a lot of the men who are, the Patriot cause fled to Connecticut or evacuated, however you want to look at it. So what can you start to say about the condition of maybe the women that were left to manage these households, and then all of a sudden these soldiers are coming up, or a general comes up and says, my men are staying here?
Yeah, there are a number of instances of what I like to call domestic resistance, that the women in their homes refuse to obey the British orders. And there are others who, of course, at the point of a gun are going to, or the threat of that, do obey. But we have a number of those instances, and we also have those accounts of the usual women that are mentioned: Nancy or Anna Strong, Sally Townsend, and who am I missing? Lady 355 with the Culper. And all of those get exaggerated, romanticized. They're not well documented historically, but part of Long Island folklore, if you will.
And we'll get to some of those, but I want to tie two things together for you, Natalie. And
okay.
Claire, you mentioned Simcoe Street. So a lot of, we'll talk about the evidence of what remains, or, we might reveal, or, you'll discover why certain things are named what they are. So I grew up in Queens near Francis Lewis Boulevard. And he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And Natalie, just to get to the woman's experience, his wife suffered for his activities, would you say? Or can you tell the story of Elizabeth Lewis?
Which, I've now forgotten. So
I think, or Joanne, you might know, she was basically taken prisoner or held, depending on how you want to frame it.
Finally exchanged, wasn't it? And
she, the thing is, I want to bring up again, because I don't think Natalie is giving herself enough credit, her book with the women. And there are a lot of details even that I did not put in my section, so that's worth reading. But with Elizabeth Lewis, yes, she was taken and put on, I think she was put on the Jersey, which was the worst of the British prison ships. They would take ships and demass them. In those ships, we're looking at disease, starvation, all kinds of things from the surroundings in there. When she did get off of there, she did pass on not too long after because of the conditions within the ship as well. And just to, as a reminder as well, not only on Long Island, but with all 56 signers of the Declaration, Many of them, and I even want to say most of them, their families suffered. Some of them, they were hiding in woods. Some of them, they never saw their families again. Houses burned. Think about Francis Lewis, not Francis Lewis, out in Lloyd Neck. I'm sorry, not out in Lloyd Neck, but in with the other signers.
William
that
Floyd,
their
yeah.
William Floyd, yes, William Floyd, that their homes were just destroyed. So he had to come back and rebuild, and then he would eventually go upstate to another property up there.
And his wife was one of the refugees in Connecticut and
Yes.
died fairly young. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, just to give another point of view of women's experience, the house right next to what's now called Raynham Hall was another brother, Jacob Townsend Jr., who died before the war began. So his widow was trying to keep her household together with 3 daughters who were living at the household. And right next door at Samuel Townsend's house, now Raynham Hall, they were billeting commanders. And one of those early commanders was Major Joseph Green, who ended up falling in love with Hannah Townsend, who lived next door. And she married him. And the mother might have been happy about that because she now had no husband bringing in wealth into her family. And now her daughter Hannah is married to this fine officer in the British Army. And they ended up, of course, having to leave the country with no ability to return after the war. He was Irish, and they went back to Ireland. And years later, their son came back for a visit, but they were never allowed to return home again. So interesting.
So just to sort of, yes, flash forward from that. So there were a number of loyalists that evacuated with the British in 1783. So would you say that's not an uncommon occurrence that a local Long Island woman would have married a British officer and picked that side, basically?
There are a number of accounts of that, certainly, and documented that they were British soldiers, understandably, were marrying women that were had come to know on the island.
And just one point to make, just to hammer home, the danger that, and I don't know if anyone's in the habit of reading old dissertations, but there's a great one called "The State of Wretchedness" of 2005, which is a phrase of Washington, but he's talking about the amount of sexual violence that the British were. So if we talk about them losing the hearts and minds, that was definitely a danger for the women that stayed on Long Island. So I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on that, or I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, what's usually quoted is a British officer on Staten Island who kind of makes, we've had the most amusing court martials here or something like that. The women seem to take it seriously. Of course, they took it seriously.
Right. And these are the kind of stories that were silenced or not reported. So it's good that you're doing this research. Claire, we haven't mentioned, or you've mentioned, but we'll bring into fuller light the enslaved populations on Long Island. And do you want to speak a little to that experience and how prevalent it was?
Often in school, we are introduced to the topic of slavery in America as a Southern institution. And sometimes it's exclusively talked about in the context of the Civil War. But when we go back to the Revolutionary War, New York had more slavery than any other northern colony by a lot. In fact, New York City and Charleston were the top 2 cities in the colonies by way of slavery, the amount of slavery. And so if you think about Long Island, it's 16 to 20% of the population are enslaved Black people. And if you get into more rural areas like Brooklyn or the Bronx, it could be as high as 30% were enslaved Black people. And it wasn't just an uncommon thing that the occasional rich person would do. It was the driver of the economy in many ways. Enslaved Black people were doing all the hard work. And so when we think about what were the colonial jobs that people did, you can talk about barrel makers, you can talk about woodworkers and carpenters and farmers, but you should also put enslaved Black people into the group because they were doing a large amount of the group work. So teachers, if you're handing out worksheets, I've seen quite a few of them for colonial jobs that omit the work and the labor of enslaved Black people. It was a large portion of the population. That's why I regard Liss as a founding figure, because she's a representative of that experience of so many people who have been forgotten in many ways.
And
of
in many ways,
course,
she.
you know,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Natalie. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention uh, the picture of Liz that is behind Claire is they didn't have she didn't have her portrait painted.
Of course.
But Claire had her portrait painted.
That's right.
So.
This is a representation of Liss, a visual representation that I had an artist make, and that's necessary because we're a visual society. And I'm always very clear about that with people, that this is not an old oil painting, it's a new oil painting, but it is helpful. It is helpful because they are not in the paintings. They're often only in the background if they're anywhere at all.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to talk about people, sometimes we have to create imagery as well.
And if I could just mention quick that also with women and Long Island and the people that really held Long Island together, while the militias were out fighting, while the Continental Army was off of Long Island after the Battle of Long Island, that one of the things to remember about Long Island that we should think about is really the amount of suffering that went on here under occupation and the appreciation that we have in history today for looking back into history. I'm sure anyone who's taught understands that sometimes it's very difficult to get students to really appreciate history rather than, oh, I'm just memorizing this or that. But there was a lot of suffering, and women really undergirded a lot of that, not only physically, as was mentioned, the assaults on them, but also economically because of things that were taken. One of the women, and I think Natalie had it in one of her articles, woman who owned a tavern, and British wanting to come in, and they wanted the alcohol and everything else on it in that tavern, and her resisting with that. So the thing is that we need to instill with current population that this was a time in history where freedom was not free, and it was a good beginning to what we needed to do for the next 250 years.
I just wanted to go back to Liz for a sec because she complicates the narrative in a lot of interesting ways. So in terms of the enslaved population, they were owned by people that were fighting for freedom, and yet the British occupied the land and offered them freedom if they fought for the British. So Claire, how do you see that playing out in the life or around Liss?
So in Liss's example, she was a teenager when the war began, and she began to encounter these British officers who are now part of her daily work. They're VIPs living inside this household with the family, increasing the workload for the dozen or more enslaved people who lived on that property along with Liss. And so Liss is hearing messages through these commanders, especially John Simcoe, the commander of the Queen's Rangers. He was a lifelong believer that slavery was morally wrong. And so what was he saying to Liss when she was encountering him inside the household? Well, I believe he may have been encouraging her to escape, because on May 18th of 1779, when his Queen's Rangers regiment left the town, she left with them. Now, the British would soon promise enslaved people their freedom at the end of the war if they would switch sides and come over to the British side. And so because of that, Liss had this hopefulness that she might get her freedom at the end of the conflict, whenever that was. But in the meantime, she was just immediately re-enslaved now by the British in Manhattan. And so George Washington sees the British getting enslaved people into their army. Then he makes a deal. I will encourage enslavers to put their enslaved black men in my Continental Army. And what will their reward be? If the enslaved man serves without any trouble for 3 years and survives, at the end of the war, the enslaved person gets their freedom, and the enslaver gets 500 acres of land. Where does that come from? Indigenous people land, right? The land of indigenous people. So Washington, as an enslaver, is promising a whole lot to the white people who are enslaving people, and to the black people, possible freedom. And so many people took advantage of these two offers.
Yeah, I'm curious. Does anyone know or have handy how many blacks left with the British in 1783?
Over 3,000 from New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a sizable number that saw that as their way out.
Yeah, there's great records of that. The Americans and the Canadians have side-by-side records, which is called the Book of Negroes. And you're able to see people who enslaved them, their age, a short physical description of them. So it's a great resource.
Yeah, I want to talk about records in a second, but one of the other aspects that I don't see get talked about much, if we've talked about the deprivations and the British soldiers quartering and taking things and foraging. To add on top of that, I would just want to bring in the concept of the whaleboat wars and the raiding that was going on across the Sound.
Yeah.
So I don't know if any of you want to jump in and what you've found or researched about that kind of activity that
Sure.
wasn't even loyalist versus patriot at some point. It was more just people getting what they wanted.
Yeah, if I could, because I do have that in my
Sure.
book. The whaleboat raids really, as soon as people started going up, and a lot of them went from Suffolk County up on the North Shore, say Southold area, they went up to Connecticut. There's a great historic book. I do have a copy, and it is really a classic today. It's called The Refugees of 1776 from Long Island to Connecticut. And a lot of those people that went up there, they did stay, some did not, because there wasn't enough services, there wasn't enough area to hold all the Long Islanders in addition to the people from Connecticut. So they wound up coming back. But those that stayed up there were the attacks, these whaleboat raids. And whaleboats were about 30 feet long. They were pointed on both sides so they could be easily handled. And they would come back to Long Island and strike. The loyalists say that we're here, taking things, guerrilla warfare, they called it, whatnot. And there was additionally then the people from Long Island, some of the soldiers, the British soldiers from Long Island that might go up to Connecticut, find these people and go as well. But whaleboat raids were very common. And if you think about it today, again, you have to use your idea of what you know of geography with the Long Island Sound, and how easily it might have been. And for them, using a boat was the way. They don't necessarily have to think about a motorboat or a bridge or something getting up to Connecticut. They would understand the idea of using a boat of some sort. So it was definitely a political strike. It was an economic strike. And it was social strike as well against loyalists and against the British soldiers coming back down here and those that went up to Connecticut as well.
And for the Culper Spy Ring, it was a way to land on Long Island if you
good cover, yeah.
If you were Caleb Brewster and you were brave enough with his crew, they could slip by these British warships and land in properties that were friendly to them and sneak back this intelligence that had been gathered at British headquarters of Manhattan and across Long Island by the Culper Jr. and Culper Sr. And they had also put in that group of documents the recent newspapers from New York City, so they could get the British perspective on things from the news.
Yeah, let's spend some time on the Culpers, which is a whole workshop in itself, if not more. There's a whole TV series on it. So, but in a way, it's sort of it's a success story, right? We're talking about a lot of 7 years, 3 months of occupation, but the Culper story is something you can point to it or as something that that came out of this that was good. And I don't want to assume that everyone knows the basics of the stories, but Claire, do you want to give us the high points, just because I know you've unraveled a lot of it in your research?
First, let's remember the spy before the Culper Spy Ring, Nathan Hale. He was a young man who, right after we lost Long Island and New York City, came over from Connecticut and was immediately caught and hanged to death. So Washington's realizing with his Major Benjamin Talmadge, they can't just send people from the American side over to the Long Island side without them being noticed. It certainly did happen, but in Nathan Hale's case, it happened tragically. And so they're building a new idea, which is let's locate people who are living behind enemy lines, who are on our side, and who are willing to risk their lives to collect information and then get it back over to us via these whaleboat couriers and Caleb Brewster and his group. And so in the beginning, it started with General Nathaniel Woodhull's relative, Abraham Woodhull, out in Setauket. But there wasn't a lot of action out in Setauket, so he had to get on his horse and, travel into New York City. And when he got into New York City, he had to have informants who were ready to give him intelligence, ready to go. And I believe that Robert Townsend started out as an informant of his, having a shop down in Lower Manhattan. But then he'd have to take this information all the way back out to Setauket, write it into letters, make a time when Caleb Brewster could pick all this up, and then get it over to Fairfield, where Benjamin Talmadge, our head of intelligence on the American side, can read these letters, synthesize them, and then fast horse riders called dragoons could race off to try to get them to Washington, wherever he was, on the Hudson, New Jersey, or elsewhere. So it was going all the way around the long way, basically. But they were never caught. They were successful, and the result was literally hundreds of pages of information that Washington got into his hands. If they'd have gone the short way right across the river, they probably would have been caught immediately, because everyone was being stopped and everything that they had on them was being taken out and examined. So by going in the wrong direction, they were able to succeed.
And like we've talked, if you know, the Townsend family and the Woodhull family, so the Culper people were connected to the Patriot cause from before the war. So it's not surprising that if you were to target who could be a spy, I'm sure I'm always surprised that the British didn't put the pieces together and close the ring. But that's a good thing that they didn't.
Well, Robert was very afraid that he was going to get caught. He was in constant fear, and several times during the war, he dropped off and would say, "That's it, no more, I'm not doing it anymore." And then he'd find something out and he'd say, okay, I'll get back in there again. Then when Benedict Arnold came over to the British side and entered Manhattan, he rounded up 40 different people, arrested them, and many of them were people that were working with Robert. So we don't know exactly who all those people were, but Robert attests to this in his letters, that they were people he was connected to. And so he left Manhattan and he went into hiding on Long Island for 3 months. And this was at the, he sneaks back into town in early 1781 and just moves his whole apartment and shop over to the South Street Seaport area, a place called Peck Slip. And after that, no more letters in writing. He would only meet Woodhull in private, in a place that they would set up ahead of time, because he was just sure he was going to get caught.
Yeah. Well, he's a fascinating character in itself. When you read, I always feel his personality come through in terms when you hear about how nervous he was, and he sounds like a modern man in terms of his anxieties. And
Woodhull was super nervous too. Woodhull was so nervous because
you
he
can
was
see
getting
why
stopped.
the conditions.
He had to make it from Setauket to Manhattan, so the British started really stopping him. And his excuse that he was going to visit his sister just wasn't working anymore. So that's why he decided to put Robert in charge of Manhattan. He would stay in Setauket, and men like Austin Rowe and other couriers would go back and forth because he had to stop traveling so much. They were going to catch him. And so that's when they instituted the idea of the courier system.
Sure. And Natalie, I'm going to pivot a little bit with you, but so the Culper story is a great segue into talking about myths and maybe where the historical record clashes with folklore and folk tales. What parts of the Culper story would you point to as a historian that you think need a little more support or evidence for?
Sally Townsend and her clothesline, ostensibly. Although there's,
you mean Anna Strong and her clothesline?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. The Anna Strong, Nancy Strong, yeah.
Yeah, she went by Nancy. Which was she would signal the legend or the oral history is that she would hang clothes on the clothesline to
I think
alert.
That's one of them. And Lady 355. That's they had a code with numbers. That was the Culpers had a code. And 355 was the code for a lady, for a woman. But it's been used, and there's a new historical novel out that attributes the Lady 355 to a cousin, is it, of William Floyd? Anyway, but
and I lift this up as a possibility for 355. She certainly had a lot of contact with Robert Townsend, and really that 355 myth is all based on part of one sentence. Just one sentence. That's it.
And that's the only time they use that code, right? In the letters.
Well, unless there's ones that we don't have, there's a lot of missing letters. But the only thing they state about her is that she had a special ability to outwit them all. And so we can all think about what that special ability might be. And when I think about Liss, I think about an enslaved woman who's in British spaces, having quote unquote joined their side. But you could come up with other scenarios too.
Sure.
The fact is, without any more information, we just can't necessarily know.
Yeah.
But if you do bring up Sally Townsend, that's a fascinating wrong legend. There was a historian in the 1930s named Morton Pennypacker, and he found out in East Hampton an account of two enslaved black women overhearing plans of the Benedict Arnold treason plot in the Gardner house. And 10-year-old young John Lyon Gardner was there in the house and witnessed this. And later on, he wrote in a pamphlet about John Andre's execution that his aunt, Mary Gardner, had heard from these two enslaved black women, that they had overheard that this American general was going to give up our American fort to the British. She had the perfect opportunity to stop that. Mary did, Gardner. She was already meeting with an American captain who was sneaking into town to tell her about her son, who was a surgeon in Washington's army. But instead, she didn't tell him. Why? She said it was just the foolish talk of these black women. She didn't value them. And instead, Morton Pennypacker also didn't value them. He took that account and completely whitewashed it. He said, oh, that didn't happen in East Hampton. That happened in Oyster Bay. That didn't happen at the Gardner house. It happened at the Townsend house. These two black women didn't overhear it. Sally Townsend did, Robert's little sister. And that wrong whitewashed version got lifted up, made into a radio play, made into books. It's alluded to on the historic marker outside of Raynham Hall that's still there today, in a large marker at Fort Hill Cemetery, and on and on and on. So when we discover the things that are true, we need to put that out there and stop retelling the legends, even if they're fun.
Right,
We have to
which is
stop
hard
saying
because,
them.
like with newspapers, the retraction is on page 50, where the headline is what
Exactly.
people remember. So, Joanne, as a historian, let's pivot into sources maybe. What has surprised you in your research on the Revolution? Is there a dearth of sources? What did you find the most fruitful sources? What do you want to say about it?
Absolutely. And you know something, it was one of the things that was just wonderful to do was all the resources that there are. We could talk about the major societies, historic societies or libraries like Brooklyn or Queens or something like that. Even Hofstra, Natalie mentioned that. Just as a side note, I used to love going to the Hofstra government documents section. And with that, they had a 21 volume of the minutes of the Continental Congress. When they digitized everything, I asked them, what'd you do with those books? What'd you do with those books? And I never found out, but it was just wonderful to sit there and read that. But as far as all the sources, one of the best sources here on Long Island are all of the little archives, the smaller local history parts of libraries. Even the Mineola, if you're familiar with the cottage there, I use that really nice woman who oversaw that. You mentioned the Patchogue Medford Library, Smithtown Library, just all over Long Island have these local sources. Plus, many of the libraries, even like Manhasset or whatnot, that have the larger volumes, historic volumes. And as I mentioned, the one for the refugees of 1776. And beyond that, there are also ones such as at the Manhasset Library. They have an archive section, which today they've had for a couple of few months up an exhibit right in their foyer as you come in, if you want to go into the Manhasset Library, of a combination of the title of it is George Washington's Grand 1790 Grand Tour of Long Island, plus the Culper Spy Ring. And if you get a chance to go into that. But for me, one of the things that was just surprising is how much literature there is here on Long Island that you can acquire from local sources in libraries, plus going out to historic homes and whatnot as well. Then obviously the Library of Congress or anything else that went there. Documents as well. I am a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the American Revolution Roundtable in New York City. And in acquiring information, it's also very possible to get from these societies that hold a lot of the American Revolution institution. Now, the thing is, I would definitely suggest a lot of on-site visits to historic homes. We've mentioned Sagticos Manor, obviously Raynham Hall, Rock Hall, all of them. many of them. And one of my favorites as well is the Sands Willett House in Port Washington they have a great little archive section upstairs as well. And these people are willing, with some kind of professionalism, willing to allow people to research. You find things that are there without having to go to some larger institution like the Library of Congress or something else. So as far as me, I was absolutely astounded by how much I could find out. And I'm still finding out today every time I go someplace as well.
That's great. Natalie, what are some of your favorite primary sources?
It varies. I just did articles, not a book. But one thing that is not in my book or have published, and I didn't have Long Island sources for this, but some of the research indicates, so many of the women were left alone to run the household. If they were refugees in Connecticut, again, they were running things over there in charge of the household while husbands and sons were off fighting. And some who have studied this have said there was a definite shift in that before the war, it was definitely the men who were in charge, and a shift even in language after the war, our home, our household, so that you have, by virtue of having to take responsibility, things changed for the women.
Well, it shows how
you asked for sources, and Sally has 2 bibliographies I prepared that she can send for those who are attending on the revolution.
Great. No, and just your example there, it shows how closely, if you read these things so critically and closely, you can uncover these new facts. We'll turn this over to the audience in a minute.
Can I just add one thing real quick?
Yeah, Claire, I just want to ask you to.
Yeah, one of the things that I did to try to help students and teachers see primary documents from my research, because a lot of the things I discovered about Liss were almost like breadcrumbs inside of really obscure archives. So in my book, I worked with the New York Archives teaching platform called Consider the Source. So at the end of each chapter, these QR codes lead you to the primary documents for that chapter. And they're transcribed, and there are questions around each one, so that everyone can see the real documents for themselves, and students can see that it's a true story, and they can really see these old documents in the classroom.
That's great. And so we're going to pivot to the Q&A kind of, and I'm looking at the chat. So this is appropriate since we're hosted by PBS or funded by PBS. What did you all think of the Ken Burns American Revolution?
I thought he did a wonderful job, particularly in emphasizing or introducing, because it's at that stage, introducing indigenous populations and their role in the revolution, and women, those who have been marginalized traditionally in many of the sources. And certainly Claire's work does give us that fascinating story of an enslaved Black woman. So she's certainly contributed as well.
I have to brag a little. My book, Espionage and Enslavement, was chosen by PBS Books as one of just 18 books in the nonfiction category to read for the Revolution.
Oh, great.
They didn't tell me they did that. I had to find it accidentally, but it was pretty exciting to find out.
So, Claire, I'm assuming you watched it, and we were talking before about the lack of espionage as a main topic, but what did you think of the doc overall?
It's true that the Culper Spy Ring wasn't covered, but the way in which they humanized the war in that documentary, and they did point out the contributions on both sides of enslaved Black people, indigenous people, and women, and just how nobody knew how it was going to turn out. We're sitting on the other side of history looking back and knowing how it resolved. But many people had their entire wealth, their lives, their livelihood wrapped up in how this was going to go. And so there were a lot of people who were fence sitters. They were just sitting, trying to figure out how they could please both sides. So no matter what happened, they wouldn't be destroyed.
Right.
And that's interesting to think about, too.
Joanne, did you watch?
Bits and pieces here and there. I have so much of it taped that one of the things with Ken Burns is that he goes into background, and he spent 9 years. He and his colleagues spent 9 years working on this. He does acquire, which is terrific, a lot of the vignettes, not only of people, but of documents, of graphics and everything that he put in there, which makes it a little bit more lively. I just want to segue over into one other. Perhaps I don't know if Natalie or Claire would agree with me, but when that series came on Turn, both of the American Revolution organizations I'm in, the Daughters of the American Revolution and the American Revolution Roundtable in New York City, of which I'm on the board with that. I'm the speakers coordinator. None of us like that. I see some other heads shaking, but that was another one. But Ken Burns, you can generally see that he is very professional in what he does.
Great. So another question: the British held on to it was the one place they held on to for the whole length of the war in New York. So what was the strategic importance to them of maintaining control of Manhattan, but let's say Long Island itself? Why did they want Long Island?
It fed the troops. It provided cordwood to heat the troops during the war. I mean, it was very important for their occupation, certainly.
And a deep water port. It was
Yes.
a very important port itself. Yeah.
And control of the Hudson, given their plan at the beginning of the war to try to divide off the New England colonies from where they thought the most intense Patriot, Concord, Lexington, and all that. They thought the rest of the colonies were not as concerned.
Yeah. It was actually another Townsend, Peter Townsend, who created that great chain, that enormous metal chain in the Hudson at West Point Fort. So they were really, really trying to keep the British from controlling the Hudson.
Absolutely. And they went after the Battle of Long Island, then they went to Kips Bay. Obviously, then in New York City, the Battle of Fort Washington, and then New York City was taken over as well. So as Long Island went, then New York City went as well. Very important. And New York City at that period of history for them to control. If you think about where we were at that period of history between New England and the Southern colonies, very important for them to control, and why Washington provided a ruse towards the end of the war of trying to overtake and trying to get back New York City, when in fact they went down to Virginia again. So very important in this area strategically.
Yeah, and the Burns documentary does have the Battle of Long Island.
He did a great job of mapping that out. Yeah. Was there ever, I don't know if we're not all military historians, but was there ever a credible attempt to take back New York? I know Washington wanted to, but did they ever get close to?
No, that was a ruse at that point when he did that. It was not the attempt. And I believe that from what I know, from what I've read, that it would not have been possible. The British, not only after the Battle of Long Island, they situated an enormous number of British soldiers in the New York City area. And Washington, you remember, at different points of the war, was having to disperse his troops in certain areas. So it was more beneficial to bring everything down to Virginia, where the war had already started to wind down by 1781 up north, and then it was continuing on down in the south. And then obviously the British ships were able to be captured. The French were a big help in doing that as well.
And I think, I'm not sure which of your works I got this from, but I saw the stat that at the height of the occupation of Long Island, 1 in 6 people were either a Hessian or a British troop.
That would be during the winter
when they were quartering.
We talked about. I think I had that figure. I don't remember where I got it. But
so here's as kind of a follow up or a question. What was the aftermath like? If you look at after the war, after Evacuation Day, which I think we should bring back, celebrating Evacuation Day.
Absolutely.
But so what was the condition of the Long Island? Did it take a long time to recover? Were we sort of economically depressed for a while? What do you see as the immediate, say, 20-year aftermath?
Could I address that? Oh, I'm sorry, Claire.
No, go ahead.
Could I address that? Because my next book, the George Washington's Grand Tour of Long Island, that addresses a lot of what you were just mentioning. Washington would be set in as president, and he did 3 tours. One was of New England, 1789. Long Island was 1790. Southern colonies was 1791. And when he came back to Long Island, there were speculations about whether he was coming to view what the economic situation was, but also whether he was traveling Long Island 4 nights, 5 days, going from the Brooklyn area out to about as far as what we might consider the Patchogue area, up to through Coram today, and then back through Queens area. Also, that perhaps coming to thank the spy ring. But there are different comments that he made. For one thing, about because he was a farmer, and one of the nurseries of trees and bushes and all that in the
Flushing.
Queens area.
Flushing.
In Flushing, yes, that he was not that thrilled with it initially, but that it had to be something that was then renovated over a length of time. And as he traveled around Long Island for 4 nights, 5 days, he saw and he interacted with a lot of people all over the island. Remember that travel at that time was not what it is today. We were 123 miles then, and we're 123 miles today, 118 rather, and 23 miles north and south. So the traveling was very lengthy for that length of time, but he was also going around staying in these different taverns and homes that were still in existence at the time. And for the most part, people were starting to come back to life again for that. So we want to say that there was definitely periods of Long Island, areas of Long Island had to be renovated, but for the most part, it was starting to really come to life again.
And Claire, I'm reminded there's a line in Hamilton about the freedom of the slaves, and they say not yet. So in terms of Liss's perspective, the post-revolution, did it change much of her situation?
You know, she showed great agency at the end of the war. She had become pregnant, and she did not want to evacuate with the British because she didn't want to go to Nova Scotia, perhaps, where she had no resources, didn't know anyone. So she actually appealed to Robert Townsend to buy her from the British. And even though he was soon to join the New York anti-slavery movement, he agreed to buy her at her own request. So she became now enslaved by Robert, had a little boy in February of '83 named Harry, and maybe that was going to be her happy ending, but she ended up being resold to a mutual friend of theirs, and this woman remarried. Her new husband sold Liss out to Charleston. So Liss ended up down in Charleston, separated from her son, enslaved by a violent man who had been part of the Boston Massacre many years earlier. And it took 2 years for Robert to find out that she was down there and smuggle her back up to Long Island to be reunited with her son in Oyster Bay. So enslaved people were in precarious situations. They were still not free, and anything could happen to them. And in her case, terrible things happened to her.
And Natalie, the roulette wheel has stopped at you. So if you want to give us a final summation, or what do you want our audience to know about Long Island during the occupation or during the Revolution, and maybe as a kickoff to celebrating the rest of the year of this tour?
I'm going to just say something about, again, after the war, as I was thinking of New York State passed an act of attainder. Do I have the attender? Anyway, they were trying to punish the loyalists. On Long Island, not very many lost their land. Certainly the Martins did not. And things, there were some, and there was one from Rock Hall who went on the ship of the Negroes and then comes back eventually. But again, I think we have to, maybe I didn't get to say that it was very much a civil war, but it wasn't as long-lasting as the Civil War in mid-19th century, when the South keeps fighting or maintaining those divisions much, so that things, return to fairly decent relations between those who had been opponents during the war.